Meanwhile, a group of pro-Brexit economists have claimed that abolishing tariffs after we leave the EU could boost the UK economy to the tune of £135 billion a year. Joining us now from Westminster to discuss this, the former Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe, that's Lucy Thomas, and the Deputy Editor of BrexitCentral, Hugh Bennett. Welcome both. Lucy, can we start with you? On the Patrick Minford, Roger Bootle claims, I mean, it's a substantial claim, isn't it? 135 billion. Their maths have been criticised in some quarters. What do you make of it?
Well, I think they're forgetting a couple of things. First of all, they're assuming that there will be no tariffs whatsoever, and all of these things are down to negotiation, so there's a very big assumption there. But also they're forgetting the fact that leaving the EU will disrupt our trade with the EU, our largest trading partner, to a certain extent too. So there's a certain amount of wishful thinking, I think, within that paper, and it's ignoring a lot of the practicalities and a lot of the realities that we will see both in trade deals with the rest of the world, but also the disruptive effect of leaving the EU.
Hugh Bennett, wishful thinking.
Well, I think there are a lot of positives from the paper. I think the key advantage of the paper is that it highlights things that essentially the UK can do itself. It isn't dependent on having to sign a trade deal with the EU or with other countries. It's all talking about the unilateral removal of tariffs. You know, I think they argue that this would bring down prices significantly for consumers, and I think they are definitely looking at it from the consumer point of view, not the producers. You know, I think there is merit in that. I think a lot of the criticisms have come from the same economists whose forecasts are really not looking too good after all of their predictions for what would happen after the EU referendum went wrong. But I think, you know, at the same time, I think the economists for free trade, they do need to say, you know, how would they manage the short-term disruptive effects? You know, if you're going to lower a lot of tariffs, you know, it will require changes from the UK industry. So I think, yeah, they've got to look at the whole picture. There's a lot of merits in I think, in the pure economics of their suggestion.
Lucy, on that point, if I can put it as crudely as your side, have your side been humble enough in accepting that economically, you know, last week unemployment lowest since 1975, exports up fairly sharply, that some of the more dire predictions for the Brexit effect, at least yet, haven't materialised?
Well, we've seen sterling fall around 15 points, and that has meant inflation rising higher than
the economy,
real
which everybody
wages.
thought was quite a good idea, didn't they?
Well, I think when prices in the shops go up, when consumers are complaining of higher prices, that is a real squeeze in people's pockets. So I wouldn't say it's all going swimmingly at all. And if actually you look at the impact on investors and on what's happening to the pound today as a result of the Brexit talks stalling, I think the long-term implications aren't brilliant. Of course, none of us want to see the economy being damaged. And so, you know, if we end up out of Brexit and there isn't any damage, fantastic. I don't want to be a doom-monger, but I think the real impact of the fall in sterling and rising inflation is real, and it's there for everyone to see.
Hugh Bennett, let's just set the economy to one side and talk about the ECJ. There'll be a positioning paper, we're told, later this week looking at alternatives. One well-known commentator has come out and said, look, you know, maybe we should look to the EFTA model as a way of resolving trade disputes. Is that a goer?
Well, I think the EFTA model is interesting because it certainly is different in the way it operates from the ECJ. I think there isn't this principle of direct effect on UK law, which is obviously a big issue with the ECJ. It's not politically motivated in the same way the ECJ is. You know, I think the ECJ in many ways is just the judicial arm of the Commission. It's there to uphold the treaties. It's there to support the principles of ever closer union. So it's not really an impartial judiciary in that sense. So the EFTA Court, I think, rather than being a natural solution, I think it offers an interesting precedent. You know, I think the president of the court, Karl Boudenbach, has said, you know, it's possible the UK could join. I think the UK more wants to look at it as, you know, precedent for saying you can have close cooperation with the EU, you can cooperate on judicial matters, but you don't need to do this by having, you know, the direct effect of the European Court of Justice, which, you know, you have to go back to sort of colonial China to look for a precedent of where a foreign court would have, you know, direct jurisdiction over another country in the way the EU is calling for.
Lucy, do you agree with that view that increasingly it is how to resolve some of the dilemmas posed by the ECJ and its continuing jurisdiction? You know, more than the divorce bill, more than rights of residency, more than the Northern Irish border, the European Court of Justice, and to what extent it can still control aspects of British life emerge as the central point in the argument.
Yes, because I think it links together a lot of those things, whether it is policing those citizens' rights, whether it is about our trading with the single market and so on. It does have a big job on how all of that is policed is absolutely at the heart of lots of those issues. I think it's encouraging that the EFTA court seems to be met with a positive view from right across from Brexiteers and others, but I think big issues like the Euratom and how the nuclear industry is governed going forward, that wouldn't be covered. My understanding is it wouldn't be covered by the EFTA court. So there are some big practical implications which would not be covered by EFTA, including medical isotopes, cancer treatments, things like that. So there are still some big questions to resolve, and ultimately sort of the nitty-gritty of that EU law and any future trading deal and how all of that is policed is a big part of everything.
Hugh, away from the nitty-gritty and onto the politics, Chukramunda's been on manoeuvres this morning. He's talked about the necessity for Labour to find some, as he put it, clear red water to put between it and the Conservatives.
Well, I think the Labour frontbench position. You had Barry Gardiner coming out the other week and saying Labour's committed to leaving the single market in the customs union. It would be madness not to. That's then been rowed back on straight away by the Leader's office. But I think underlying it, Labour know the fundamentals of what Brexit involves. I think there was that huge study that came out last weekend, which showed that I think 2/3 of people, Leavers and Remainers, they agreed that Brexit would have to mean leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, leaving the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. I think they recognise that control is the most important thing. So I think ultimately, if Labour decides to set its stall up by trying to fight against that, you only have to look at what happened to the Lib Dems at the last election. They ran on a strongly anti-Brexit platform. They ended up doing dismally in the polls. They lost seats. They didn't lose seats, but they lost vote share. I think their whole strategy didn't work. So I think Labour has recognised, as one of the two main parties, it has to respect the democratic outcome. And I think if it tries to fight against that and tries to fight against what people understand of Brexit, they're going to get punished in the polls. Yeah,
I mean, we're in that interesting phase, aren't we, Lucy Thomas? The next fortnight or so after the summer holidays, people in the Labour Party, we've talked about Chukramunda and some of his confederates, but it's just as true you can argue on the Conservative side as well. They've gone away, they've gone for their walks, they've sat around talking about this over long lunches. New divisions are likely to open.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to what you take Brexit to mean. And it's interesting, Hugh talks about there's a survey of 2/3 of people saying we should leave the single market and customs union, Leavers and Remainers. I can point to another survey of 2/3 of people saying we should stay in the single market. So I think it depends what kind of a question you ask. And I think the point Chukramunda this morning was making is that, look, do you come down to a dogmatic view about the overall outcome, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, or are you pragmatic? Do you think about the practicalities and what that means for trade? And I think within the Labour Party in particular, there are many MPs and members who would say it's about the practicality, making sure trade is as frictionless as possible, not about some dogmatic ideological view about a particular position leaving the single market, for example. So I think absolutely lots of discussions will have been had over the summer within all different parties, and I think the tone and the tenor of the negotiations is really important, as the UK is suggesting we need to speed up the talks and the EU is saying they need to see sufficient progress being made.
Lucy Thomas, Hugh Bennett.